Unfortunately, also mirrored the language of the perpetrators. You know, this whole don't have contact with your friends and family, you can't leave the house, you know, you can't go to work. It really played into that, and certainly an awful lot of documentaries that I've seen subsequently about lockdowns and domestic abuse have really sort of mirrored that. The home environment started to become a little bit of a pressure cooker. You know, there's no respite, whereas children would normally go to school or people would go to work, all those avenues shut down. So where maybe somebody was able to go out during the day and just get some sort of time away from the situation, we were all working from home and homeschooling as well. And the interesting thing that a lot of professionals are asking at the moment is what is going to happen when all the restrictions end? You know, the perpetrator, potentially by June the 21st, if all goes to plan, will lose all control again. People are going back to work, back to their offices, children have gone back to school, and some of those restrictions that they've been able to apply to their victims will start to lift. And I think the thing to mention as well, if you're working with somebody, just think about, particularly if the message was somebody who was shielding, someone who was very much told not to go out of the house, you know, they became very dependent on their perpetrator, maybe for shopping, for medication, and for other items. So again, it's that real balance of power that's been off kilter. Next slide, please. Now, this is where we've stood with our definition of domestic abuse for a number of years. I will talk about the new Domestic Abuse Act in a moment, but this is where we've been. So it's an incident or pattern of incidents of controlling, coercive, threatening behaviour, violence or abuse between those aged 16 or over who are or have been intimate partners or family members, regardless of gender or sexuality. The abuse can encompass, but is not limited to, physical, sexual, financial, psychological and emotional. And this definition includes honour-based violence, female genital mutilation and forced marriage. Now, very much a case, I think we all think back to that physical, particularly we're sort of going back to the 1970s again, the idea of the battered women, you know, seeing posters with black eyes or broken bones. But really these days, it's really emphasising that we're sort of seeing so much more than that physical violence. And we use the word financial in this definition as well. And as I go forward and talk about it, we'll see that financial is being moved to economic because it's got a far more wide-reaching scope. Now, this was changed in 2012 because of the change in age. It used to be those aged 18 or over, and it was actually lowered to 16. And there's many reasons for this. And one, in part, it was recognition of the fact that younger people were having seriously high-risk relationships. And certainly when I talk to our IDVAs, our independent domestic violence advocates who work with the high-risk cases, they are seeing 18 and 19-year-olds in extremely high-risk relationships. So again, it's in recognition of that, but it's also something you may or may not have heard of, APV, adolescent to parent violence. I think quite often we think domestic abuse is happening between the adults in a relationship, but it can also be that the children are the abusers. So by recognising 16 or over, we're looking at sort of wider than just necessarily two people in a relationship. Next slide, please. So we finally have the Domestic Abuse Act 2021. It was signed into law on the 29th of April and will slowly start to be implemented across the UK. It's to create a statutory definition of domestic abuse, emphasising that domestic abuse is not just physical violence. And I think that's the message we always try to get out whenever we speak to any groups. But it can be emotional, coercive or controlling, and also economic abuse. And as part of this definition, children will be explicitly recognised as victims if they see, hear or otherwise experience the effects of abuse, which is great news for organisations like myself, because hopefully that will start to unlock the door to some funding. I think quite often our focus has been very much on the adults in the relationship and the sort of the children as secondary, but it's really important that they're recognised in their own right. And the other important thing I want to mention is it's extending the controlling or coercive behaviour offence to cover post-separation abuse. And again, that's something when I look at later on in this presentation. Next slide, please. Now, again, as I said, the thing we always try and get across, and it's probably something that you're well aware of as professionals, is the fact that domestic abuse is so much more than the violence. It is about that coercive and controlling behaviour. And as part of the Serious Crime Act in December 2015, Section 76, we had that recognition of that psychological and emotional abuse. And it really helped to address a gap in the law that felt that was needed to really be able to support people. Next slide, please. So controlling behaviour. It's a range of acts designed to make a person subordinate or dependent on them by isolating them from sources of support, exploiting their resources and capacities for personal gain, depriving them of the means needed for independence, resistance and escape, and regulating their everyday behaviour. And when I talk to those frontline workers, I'm talking about what people can eat, what they can wear, where they go out, the fact that their trips to the supermarket are timed, there are trackers on their phones, there are trackers on their cars, you know, they are really being monitored quite closely. And coercive behaviour is an actual pattern of acts of assault, threats, humiliation and intimidation or other abuse that is used to harm, punish or frighten the victim. And when I go on to talk about economic abuse, some of that coercive behaviour is about taking on debts and the legacy that debt leaves with people. Next slide, please. So what is domestic abuse? Now, you've probably all seen this before. It's a very common tool. It's the power and control wheel. It was developed by a lady called Ellen Pence in the 1980s in America, and she worked for the Duluth Domestic Abuse Intervention Project in Duluth, Minnesota. And what she wanted to do was capture people's experiences. Everyone's experience will be different, but there will be shared similarities. And she felt that by producing something that was very visual, she would help people to understand that what they're experiencing isn't something that's only personal to them. So the outer rim of the wheel is very much about the things we can see and sort of quantify, that physical violence, that sexual violence, you know, things that will have an impact, that will leave marks. But those segments in the middle are the things that probably are harder to see, harder for people to talk about. And I just want to touch on a couple of them, certainly in relation to sort of working with people. But using intimidation, now this can be as simple as putting words or phrases into a conversation. You could be sitting with a couple and not realizing that one is sending the other very clear messages to stop talking, you know, to stop disclosing or to stop talking about their home life. But it's also very much about those non-verbal gestures as well. I've heard of things like people running their finger around the top of the glass, touching their ear, touching their collar or drumming their fingers on the desk. Again, sending a very, very clear message to stop speaking. Using emotional abuse. Now, this may be a term that you've all heard of, gaslighting. It comes from a 1944 film where basically the husband is trying to send the wife by sort of manipulating behaviours to try and send her insane. There's missing pictures, there's footsteps in the night, and the gas lights dim without anyone appearing to touch them. And this is something that we see quite regularly in our frontline work, is this idea of trying to reduce somebody's sense of self-worth, their self-esteem, their confidence, and really alter their sense of reality. There was one lady who came into contact with the service who was on quite high medication for her mental health, and she was finding saucepans in the back garden, and she started to feel that she was actually starting to have blackouts and potentially that she was a danger to her child. And it wasn't until the child actually said to her, "Why is daddy leaving saucepans in the garden?" that she realised that he was really trying to undermine her sense of reality. Minimising, denying and blaming. Now, this can come from both sides, both the perpetrator and the victim. The perpetrator will play down what they're doing. They'll outright deny that they're doing it, or they'll blame the victim for it. But similarly, the victim will take on these stances as well. And it's really important when working with someone that you listen very carefully, because they will minimise what's happening to them. They may only share a fraction of what's going on in their home life. Quite often they'll deny it. It might be the fact that they don't see it themselves, or it's the fact that, you know, they just haven't been aware of what they're happening to them is abuse. Or they'll blame themselves as well. You know, the idea that it is their fault, their partner's under stress at work, you know, there's other things going on, they're not keeping the children quiet, and that's why it's happening. Now, this says using male privilege. It's very much a case of, it's a protected document, so we can't change it, but we use this with both men and women. So we would say using gender privilege. So anything that's like, it's my house, it's my money, something that exerts power and control over somebody else. And the last one I want to touch on is using coercion and threats. Now, this is quite a powerful one. It might be the fact that somebody has got information that they're threatening to share about somebody. Maybe they've been coerced into taking out a false benefit claim, or it's the fact that, you know, there's threats about what will happen to the children or other family members if somebody leaves. But I think the ultimate one, and one again I hear from frontline workers time and again, is the perpetrator threatening to take their own life. And that can be a huge powerful barrier to people leaving, because the abused person may still have feelings towards their perpetrator, and the thought that them leaving could cause them to take their own life can be a huge reason for them staying. So in this case, what sits in the middle of all of this is power and control. And that's ultimately what domestic abuse is about that misuse of power and control in a relationship. Next slide, please. So just mentioning to you about assessing the risk. I deliver training to frontline professionals who use the DASH. So DASH is short for domestic abuse, stalking and harassment, and honour-based violence. It's a set of 24 questions about what's happening in order to identify, assess and manage the risk in a standardised framework. Our frontline workers will complete a DASH regularly with those that they're supporting, as risk is dynamic, it can change. So we need to be aware of those changes. This isn't something that only happens with high risk cases. This happens across the board. If someone answers yes to one of those 24 questions on the DASH, then their risk level would be assessed as standard. We don't use the term low risk at all in our work for many reasons. One of them is it reinforces the perpetrator's language, that no one will really sort of listen or take it seriously. By saying it low risk, it almost implies it doesn't matter. So the starting point for us is always standard. Next slide, please. Now I want to talk a little bit about disclosing, because obviously people who come to you may disclose information, and it can be a real leap into the unknown for people. And for that reason, we might not always get the full story. Silence really does enforce domestic abuse. Imagine having to tell your worst secret to someone you're maybe meeting for the first time, or a professional you've only spoken to a few times previously. You're possibly thinking about what their reaction might be, how they might judge you, or what they might say. Or you've had to recount your story so many times to different people that you can't keep repeating yourself. But ultimately, as you know, what is important is believing that person. As I said before, they may minimize their experience. Some may tell you everything from the start. Others may drip feed the information to gauge your reaction. So again, it's really important that we listen carefully. I think there's still an awful lot of shame and stigma and the worry about being judged, being linked to domestic abuse, challenged even about why you haven't even left that relationship sooner. For some, they won't even recognise it as abuse. Again, we had one lady who came into our service who was 70 years old. She'd been in a 50-year marriage and had never challenged what was happening. And it was only when her granddaughter undertook healthy relationship education at school that she saw what was happening to grandma at home and went home and had a conversation with her about it. So she had never in those 50 years identified it as abuse, even though she had to ask permission to put washing out on the washing line. It may be the case they don't want the police involved. They don't want to criminalise the abuser. And again, you know, it's the fact that they may still care for them, so they don't want that police involvement. You know, we're talking about 4 in 5 victims of domestic abuse don't report to the police, and this could be the reason why. They may have anger or mistrust of the system. You know, they've been here before, they felt that the system's let them down, and they just don't want to engage again. Again, sometimes as frontline workers, we can experience an awful lot of anger from the people because, as I say, they've disclosed the information and they don't see the changes happening as fast as they like. The big thing is about being believed as well. And again, time and again, the perpetrator may say to them, you know, if you tell people, they won't believe you, they'll think you're crazy, you know, they won't understand. And so it's another barrier, really undermining their sense of self-worth and credibility, just simply being told you won't be believed. They may blame themselves, that it's their fault that the abuse has happened, so they don't want to draw attention to themselves. Again, as I talked about that minimising, denying and blaming, it's this whole thing that they're at fault for not doing something right, and that's what's brought it on them. And I think the last two sort of link together, that idea of fear and safety. Potentially the perpetrator has told them time and again what might happen if they leave. You know, again, threats to family, to friends, to children, to pets. And I think it really does sort of play into that whole narrative about why they shouldn't leave. Next slide, please. So I think quite often when we see things on television, particularly in sort of soaps or whatever, we scream at the television, you know, why don't you just pack a bag and leave? Why don't you get out? And I think it's very difficult from us on the outside looking in to understand why this doesn't happen. As I said before, they possibly want the abuse to end, but not always the relationship. they formed a relationship with somebody. You maybe have somebody who's been in a 10, 15, 20-year marriage. There's a lot of shared experience, and obviously walking away from that, you lose your marriage. So again, a big step to take. Afraid to tell or nobody asks. Now, this is a very interesting one. Again, time and again with survivors questionnaires and surveys that they do, they said the biggest reason they never disclose is because nobody ever asks them. And I don't mean specific asking about the abuse, but as simple, is everything okay at home? As a frontline professional, it's a real opportunity for us to talk to people. And actually, just by knowing that every time you have contact with somebody, you will ask the question, is everything okay at home, allows them to make the decision about when they want to do that disclosure. Again, as I mentioned before, concerns for their safety. Very much the case that, again, as I say, the abusers may have made very specific threats about what may happen at the point of leaving. And unfortunately, as we know time and again, leaving is the most dangerous time. They may be anxious about living alone. Think back to my 70-year-old lady. She had never lived independently as an adult, never paid any bills, never managed her own money. So she had real anxiety about being on her own at the end of that relationship. They may be suffering stress and unable to make critical decisions. These people are possibly managing day-to-day work, getting children to school, managing a household, and also safety planning themselves. They know what they need to do to keep the perpetrator on side. And so there's a lot going on in their lives. And actually for them, it may be really difficult to make those critical decisions about leaving and next steps to take. They may be financially dependent. So they may be financially dependent on the abuser. They've been encouraged to give up work, to stay at home, and possibly there are debts as a family. And so by two incomes coming in, it makes it a lot easier. They've been convinced by the abuser that they're worthless and no one else will care for them. Time again, we hear, nobody else will love me. He's my world. And again, it's all part of that language of the perpetrator. They believe their partner will change. Abuse isn't always 24/7. There are going to be good times and they will cling to those good times. And when the bad times roll round, quite often there'll be promises that things will change, things will be different. And so it's a real sort of hope, if you like, that things will be different going forward. And it's also the fact they don't necessarily want their children's parents not to be involved in their lives. And they don't want that family upheaval. I think quite often people think about going into refuge, having to move away from their homes, taking their children away from school, from their friends, from their outside activities. And they don't want those children to experience that. But I think ultimately the reason that people don't leave, and quite often the reasons we see, is just being absolutely frightened of what might happen next. Next slide, please. So I really wanted to touch on economic abuse. I think sometimes, we're so focused on some of the things that happen that we don't always see some of the sort of other areas of abuse, and economic abuse is certainly one of those. And there's a fantastic website, fantastic organisation called Surviving Economic Abuse that I would signpost people to. They're very good in producing literature for both people who might be experiencing economic abuse to help them understand it and the steps that they can take, and how to deal with financial institutions, as well as organisations that might be working with people who are actually experiencing that abuse. So they define financial abuse, which is how we sort of sit at the moment with that current definition, as about being controlling finances, stealing money or coercing someone into debt. But by opening up to economic abuse, we're widening that scope. So we're saying it's not just about that, it's also exploiting or sabotaging other resources such as housing, food, property, transportation and employment. And again, this is a huge factor when it comes to economic abuse, the amount of people whose work is impacted. 1 in 5 employed women will take time off work due to domestic abuse. And again, if we're not telling people who can support us, we're certainly not telling our employers. So actually 2% of people will directly lose their jobs rather than disclose to an employer those reasons that they're taking excessive time off work. 75% of people are targeted at work as well. It may be the fact the abuser is phoning work, is standing around outside the building, is emailing them. So I think, again, it's another place where we need to be aware of what's affecting our colleagues and our friends as well. Next slide, please. So why is economic abuse really important to recognise? And this is some work Women's Aid did in 2020. It is a real barrier to leaving. Lack of access to economic resources is a reason time again that women feel they've got no choice but to stay. And because they're staying, that puts them at greater risk if they're having to live with the abusive partner for longer. It's a real barrier to that independent life. Economic abuse doesn't rely on physical proximity. Someone controls finances from afar, particularly if there's sort of ongoing child maintenance payments or an agreement about, say, payment with the mortgage. So it can continue long after separation. Women are often left in debt, and the lack of financial security impacts on their ability to rebuild their lives after leaving. Next slide, please. So this is some work that Refuge did, another national organisation. They found that 1 in 3 respondents of accessing their service didn't have a bank account, and over half were unaware that they were actually experiencing economic abuse before they actually came into contact with the organisation. I think a joint account is very much seen as a symbol of trust, and 8 in 10 women said this form of abuse spanned more than 10 years of their life. 6 in 10 survivors of coercive and controlling behaviour have been coerced into taking out debt, which can take many years to repay and will also impact their credit rating going forward. Women who can't find £100 at short notice are 3.5 times more likely to be experiencing domestic abuse. And I think sometimes people find themselves in this situation without realising. And again, a lot of the reports I've read around economic abuse really reflect this. You know, statements people make like, he said he'd take care of the finances and I'd look after the baby and the house. Or I sort of took it as a romantic gesture, you know, you don't need to work anymore. But again, it's cutting off those avenues to support and that independence. And to move on from a relationship, if you want to go into private rental accommodation, your credit rating is checked. And one survivor talked of the impact, what she described as the financial hangover. 14 years after she left the relationship, that vapor trail of the debt and the poor credit rating was still following her. And it can lead to a real loss in confidence about managing money or budgeting going forward. Over a third surveyed had asked no one for help, as they either had no one to turn to or they were too afraid to ask. And I think most interestingly, some work that Women's Aid and the TUC did looked at sort of the alternatives, if you like, is the fact that 18% of survivors had incomes of over £50,000 a year. They weren't low-income families. And professional women often talked about not being believed because they didn't fit a stereotype of what a domestically abused person looks like. They'd assumed they were educated and so they'd get out of the relationship. So again, they weren't taken seriously by the agencies that they spoke to. Next slide, please. Now, this is the sort of different stages we talk about leaving a relationship. And sometimes people will make decisions that we're working with that as professionals, we really don't understand. It makes no sense to us at all, such as returning to an abuser. And I will say it takes on average 7 attempts to leave before somebody leaves and finally stays out of the relationship. So it's not something that happens sort of in those early days when there's maybe an incident of abuse and someone recognises. It can take many, many years. Now, this was devised as a very sort of physical demonstration of it by a lady called Professor Liz Kelly, who's a professor of sexualised violence and is also the director of Child and Women Abuse Studies Unit at London Metropolitan University. And she holds the Roddick Chair on Violence Against Women. And what she wanted to do was sort of create something for professionals to see. And the idea is people can go up and down this slide many times before they finally leave that relationship. So she talks about stage 1 of managing the situation, you know, keeping the abuser happy, keeping all the plates spinning, adapting their life to meet the needs of the victim, to meet needs of the abuser. Then level 2, distortion or perspective of reality, creating reasons why it's happening. So maybe he's stressed at work, she's stressed at work, it's my fault. Stage 3 is about defining that abuse, realising that it's not okay and that person isn't happy and they want to do something about it. So stage 4 is about re-evaluation of that relationship. And that's probably when they make the decision to leave. And unfortunately, at this stage, that's when that risk starts to increase. At stage 5, they will end the relationship, but as I spoke to you before, it doesn't always mean the end of the abuse. And as I say, people will quite often go back into the relationship because it's easier to manage the perpetrator while they're living with them than it is to live independently and have them contacting them multiple times by text, by phone, by email. Next slide, please. So I want to talk about some of that sort of post-separation that people who come to the service might experience. As I say, separation is a high risk factor. It's one of the questions we ask on that DASH risk assessment. You know, is the perpetrator aware that they're planning to leave? Because there is a reason for it. 75% of domestic violence related homicides occur upon separation. And there's a 75% increase of violence upon separation for at least 2 years. As I said to you before, just because that relationship ends doesn't stop the abuse from happening. The other thing is quite often the perpetrator can appear quite polite, plausible and professional. I was talking to an IDVA last week who works with the high risk cases, and she has a couple of women who she's working with at the moment, and the ones she's most concerned about have very professional husbands. They're presenting very well to the agencies, and the women are feeling quite sort of undermined by the whole situation. The Domestic Abuse Act now, fortunately, now recognises that sort of post-separation coercive and controlling behaviour, particularly through that sort of economic channel. You know, if somebody withholds payments, withholds money, it's very difficult for somebody to move forward and make new decisions. And the other thing that can really increase after the relationship ends is stalking. Domestic abuse stalkers are the most dangerous because they know everything about your life. They know where you work, they know where the children go to school, and it can be the fact that they turn up at both the home and the workplace. For a lot of women, there's a fear of child contact sessions. Safe Lives found that former abusive partners use childcare arrangements to carry on targeting their victims in around a third of cases where children were cited as the reason for ongoing contact. And certainly during COVID, and certainly those early days with lockdown, there was an awful lot of sort of misinformation about sort of children going between parents, and certainly some children who weren't being returned to parents after they'd gone on a visit. Children can also be used to pass on abusive messages back to their mothers. And again, this is something our frontline workers see, is the fact that the children, unfortunately, can be used as the mouthpiece of the perpetrator. And certainly talking to one refuge worker once who had sort of very direct contact with one mother and a 5-year-old girl, you know, she said to look at the young girl, she was so angelic, you know, she had these beautiful blonde ringlets and an absolutely sort of gorgeous little face. But she said the language that came out of her mouth was quite clearly the language of an adult. And the mother literally took that sort of comments from the child because the child had been coached to say these things. Next slide, please. There's the final thing I want to just talk about is this sort of space for action report that was produced in 2014. And really, you know, if somebody doesn't want to accept that the relationship is over, is sort of those ways that they can interfere with it, the ways they can sort of disrupt the process. And outwardly, it may appear sort of very innocent, very sort of non-aggressive behaviour, but actually, for some, they can see what's behind it. And certainly sort of speaking to some people who've gone through this, you know, is the fact that letters weren't responded to quite quickly, you know, answers weren't given. And the solicitors were sort of taking it as that maybe somebody wasn't coping with the process very well, but the women were very clear that they knew this was part of their partner's disruptive behaviour. So things like claiming that the marriage certificate was lost, refusing to disclose addresses, ignoring divorce papers, not turning up at court, refusing to sign divorce papers, and also making counterclaims as well to try and disrupt the process. So I talked at the beginning of all of this about mentioning some of the support services that are available, and there are many that are out there. I think the first one to start with is the National Domestic Abuse Helpline, which is run by Refuge, and this is open 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Again, somewhere where people can call in and talk to people and get advice. Women's Aid also offer an online chat service, and again, not everybody's comfortable talking over the phone, so the online chat really gives them a chance to kind of engage and get help and advice. And I know there's people all over the country watching this presentation. They also offer a directory of services. So if you go onto the Women's Aid website, you can actually find what is offered in your local area in terms of local support. I often think that we know what's available for women. And again, I think there's sort of lots of barriers to leaving. And I think for men, one of the biggest barriers is knowing that there's support available for them too. And there's two big organisations, both Respect and Mankind Initiative, who work with men who are experiencing domestic abuse. For those with LGBT+, Gallup, they operate both inside London and across the country as well. And you've also got Karma Nirvana, who work with those who are experiencing honour-based or forced marriage. Hourglass is a charity that's been set up specifically to support safer ageing for women. So their clientele is very much the older end of the scale. And again, sometimes those are the figures that are missing from some of the domestic abuse sort of stats. Is quite often we capture what's happening to the younger generations, but not always to those older women. So Hourglass is there to support them with safer ageing. Similarly, there's an organisation called The Mix who work very much with those aged under 25. So again, what their literature does is very much geared to a younger generation. Another barrier to leaving can be disability, and unfortunately, disabled women are sort of overrepresented in the stats for domestic abuse. And it's not just about those physical disabilities, but also some of those hidden ones as well. So Sign Health offer a text service and also a WhatsApp service for people to actually kind of engage and get information. And they also offer online BSL film as well to help people understand what domestic abuse is all about. As I mentioned before, stalking can be something that really intensifies, particularly after a relationship ends. And there's two organisations that I would signpost to. There's Paladin and also the Susie Lamplugh Trust, and there is the National Stalking Helpline. As I mentioned before, we have IDVAs who work with those high-risk cases. There's an stalking alternative called ISVAs. And again, those organisations can put people in contact with people who can offer that advice and support. As I mentioned earlier, Surviving Economic Abuse is a great organisation with lots of information. And again, if you're working with somebody where that sort of financial side of things is something that's causing sort of tension or people not understanding, it's a great place for resources that really sort of break down into very easy to understand language. The other ones I'll mention are IMCAN, who are supporting BME women. Again, they've got a great online presence and have done an awful lot of research about, you know, how it impacts people from ethnic minorities. And Chain is another one as well, who offer online resources, because again, another barrier to leaving a relationship and seeking help can be languages. And again, very much the frontline service, you know, being very much aware of translators that are used in terms of whether or not the woman's messages are being accurately represented by the translator. The other thing I will also add, because obviously you're working with a mix of people, is Respect, as well as offering a phone line and help and support for men experiencing domestic abuse. It also offers an alternative telephone line for those who are worried about their behaviours. So for people who feel that they're sort of displaying perpetrator behaviour, they're worried about how they're treating a partner, Respect offer an alternative phone line for people to actually get help and support and advice about changing those behaviours. So I want to thank you for listening today. I realise that for some of you, it's a lot of recapping work or training that you've already completed, but I hope for all of you, you'll consider just basically asking people now, is everything okay at home, a little bit more often? Thank you.
Thank you, Karen. I think I've turned the microphone on again this time. That's really helpful, and there's so much information there and so many angles to this, and every case we see coming into mediation is slightly varied. So I think there's a lot that we always have to be thinking very clearly and cleverly about domestic abuse and how it fits together. And I think the financial one is quite an interesting side, because I think there's a lot that we focus on when children are involved and those cases, but actually it's finance ones are equally as important that we get this right in. So thank you for that. I'll just open up to any questions for Karen before we move on. Ines.
Your delivery was very impressive and comprehensive insofar as women victims are concerned. But even though you started by saying 1 in 5 men are victims of domestic violence, your focus was completely on women. And I think this is what happens in general with discussions about domestic abuse, that male victims are completely neglected by the whole support system. I know you mentioned at the end of your delivery, you know, how men there are some organizations who support men. But I mean, all the examples you gave, all the focus was, on women who are victims of domestic violence. And in my work as a mediator, I come across a lot of men who claim anyway to be victims of domestic violence. You can never be sure of what actually happened. But I've seen men who've shown me injuries. And I've also seen a lot of women who examples of women who pass abusive messages through the children to their ex-partner. So, and you mentioned stigma and shame as a factor that stops people from revealing that they're victims. But this is so much more pronounced with men, because men, for a start, are more likely to feel they won't be believed, and men are more ashamed because they're not supposed to be victims. They are physically stronger. I mean, I know of an example, a personal example of somebody who had suffered injuries, a man, went to hospital and pretended that they were accidental. So I think this is a whole area that is very much neglected.
And when we do training, we very much focus on men and the male barriers to leaving. I mean, today was very much a whistle-stop tour. I mean, anybody who's really interested in seeing the male perspective, I would very much signpost. There's a BBC documentary called Abused by My Girlfriend, and it's about a young man called Alex Skeels. And I met his IDVA, very much a male support worker who worked with Alex at the time. And Alex was only in his early 20s, and he was being abused by his female partner. And Jordan Worth, who was his female partner, was later jailed for 7.5 years for the treatment that she meted out to Alex in their relationship. So when I do the wider training, when I do the male sort of training side of things, when I talk about the DASH risk assessment as well, we do go into far more depth about how it affects men, and certainly as barriers to leaving as well. There are many reasons why men won't leave the relationship, like you quite rightly said: stigma, not being believed, the fear of leaving their children. And when you watch the documentary, it's on BBC, it's on the iPlayer, about Alex Skeels, one of the biggest reasons he didn't leave his partner was the fear of leaving the children in her care once he left that relationship. So yes, I appreciate very much, and we support men as well as women. I mean, we have a male IDVA at Leeway who works directly with men who are experiencing high-risk domestic abuse in their relationships. So our focus is on men and women, but unfortunately, as the figures show, sort of women are disproportionately affected by domestic abuse, but certainly men is an area that we do cover, and it's certainly not forgotten.
I think the male victims are definitely getting a lot more support now, and I think that they are raising in priority. So I think that is a good trend to be following, and it's making sure that we treat both parties when they come into mediation in the right way. So that was really helpful. I've got Ruth has got her hand up.
Yeah, I think you mentioned Respect being an organisation to signpost for perpetrator behaviour. My understanding is that they only deal with men, they don't deal with women. Is there a women's organisation that deals with women perpetrators?
The last time I checked the website, and the last time I checked the Respect website, it said men and women.
Ah, right, because I checked it a minute ago and it said men.
And that's changed in the last couple of months. So whether they've been I know they've seen a massive increase in traffic to their website. So it may be the fact that they've changed their focus, or some of their funding has changed. But certainly the last time I checked, which I say was only probably about 2 months ago when I was updating my information, it did mention both. Unfortunately, then I have to go and do some more hunting for female orientated organisations.
I think one of the things that I've kind of had some experience with, only because my child has done a dissertation on some of this work as well, so I've read quite a lot of literature while she's been kind of doing that, is that a lot of men will try and access services and they might ring Women's Aid and they are kind of almost dismissed out of hand. They're not really dealt with, in a very level playing field. And I think as mediators, we are an impartial party. And I think we probably more than anybody are seeing those people at those critical points of separation. So we have to be more mindful of not making those judgments and having those pre-gender bias. And if someone's telling you something, we have to accept it's their perception. We have to deal with the perception, not necessarily having to validate it, or, just we need to move them potentially to another service. So I think when we are doing things and people are coming on board, giving us lectures on, and presentations on domestic abuse, I think Ines is quite right. We're really only getting a 1-point view. I've done a lot of domestic abuse training over the last year. and it has all been very female orientated. So where do we get that balance from? You know, and this might be for you, Mike, to say, can we get somebody from Mankind to come and give us a presentation for that male perspective?
I just also add, sorry, just I'm at the moment writing a male training package, because again, that was something that we didn't have, and we had somebody from Respect actually come to present to us as an organisation as well. But I'm actually developing a male orientated package, because then it's sort of recognising some of those barriers and working with our male IDVA to make sure that that male message kind of comes across. Our female and our male services are sort of very much separated within the organisation for obvious reasons, and that's what I want to try and capture, because I agree that in some cases, you know, we don't always have both sides, and obviously we're talking about both heterosexual relationships and same-sex relationships. So again, it's very important that we represent that it may be two males in a relationship as well as a female and a male in a relationship. So yes, it's something that I see the potential for, and it's something that I want to develop as a frontline training officer, because I think it's really important that we do talk about men and how they are affected.
And I think, Mike, you know, when you're looking at training and centres of excellence for training, it's something that if we as mediators don't have both sides, how do we then help our families, you know, in those situations?
Yeah, no, it's definitely something we need to pick up on and think about. Claire.
Thank you. I was just going to ask, in your experience, Karen, how much emphasis is placed on sort of going to work actually with the perpetrator as well when you come across a victim, and what are the chances of helping them rehabilitate and perhaps break those cycles for the future?
This is where the new Domestic Abuse Act is kind of starting to change the focus. There's been an awful lot about victims leaving, victims sort of doing something to change their circumstances, and quite often, you know, that the perpetrator has potentially been the sort of forgotten party in all of it. And certainly going forward, they want to address that a little bit more. There's been some pilots run across the country. There's something called Drive, and they've been looking at perpetrator programs. In fact, we've had one been running in Norwich for the last 3 years. It's just come to the end with Norwich Connect, and they've been working with standard and medium risk families while the perpetrator is still living in the home environment. And the idea is to work with the perpetrator and the family separately to try and see if there are ways that sort of improvements can be made, and sort of looking at that dynamic in the relationship within the family. So going forward, the access to perpetrator programs is sort of been quite limited. There have been, as I say, pilots running through Drive, and they're sort of feeding back. There's one particular university that's working with the pilot to sort of capture the information. But going forward, now we've got a domestic abuse commissioner, and we're sort of widening our scope a little bit more. I think we've already been dealing with the fallout. I think now we want to start dealing with the whole root and effect, if you like, of what's going on. And potentially sort of with these programs, we might sort of see a greater rollout, and then sort of more signposting, I think, for us as professionals as to where people can go to actually get help and support.
I think a lot of that I pick up from a criminal law point of view. That's a lot of what probation do when we're doing criminal cases through domestic abuse and stalking and breaking harassment orders, all sorts of things like that. So a lot of the focus in the probation side of things will be focusing on those elements. I'm going to stop now, and thank you, Karen. That's really helpful. And it's between you and Gordon, I think this afternoon has given us so much to think about. I'm now going to pass on to Adrian. I'm sure most mediators in the room have come across Adrian in one way or other in the last 20 years in mediation, and he's just going to summarise some of the thinking around this domestic abuse and then lead straight into the workshops. So Adrian, are you there?
I am indeed, Mike. Many thanks. Mike, could you handle the slides for me?
Yeah, of course I can.
Perfect. Yeah, two excellent presentations earlier. Where do we go from here? But yeah, I'd like to build on very much on what's really just been discussed, because many people that know me know that my focus in the world of mediation is more on what I call the serious stuff that can affect mediators and certainly the clients. And when I say the serious stuff, the most serious stuff, potential suicide, murder, manslaughter, it's those situations that's what I call slip through the net, slip through assessment. And then you suddenly find that a mediator has their careers gone to pieces because they feel they've made an oversight, someone has died. Now, these may be relative rarities, but they do occur, and I hear this from other PPCs as well. And I think picking up on what Robert was saying this morning, it's about protecting the public. It's about enhancing services to the public, but it's also about protecting mediators. So, yeah, just a quick reminder here about deaths. 2 women a week, and as we've heard figures earlier, they may have in fact even higher now, and certainly doubling at times during the pandemic. Can I have the next slide, please, Mike? Thanks. The question just now about what about men? Yes, let's not overlook, whilst 80% of deaths will be female, 20% will be male. And one of the things I find as an assessor for the Family Mediation Council, which rather shocks me at times, is when I look at portfolios and find not only do some mediators seem to give scant regard to domestic abuse screening, it feels rather flimsy and somewhat shallow, but quite often they seem to be majoring on the female and not the male. And I'm thinking, where's the balance here? Okay, the reality is I've got a background in criminology. I used to be a probation officer. So I'm aware that most violence, most serious violence, tends to be against women. There's no doubt about it. Most deaths are against women. But males do die. And males do also get seriously injured and can be subject to domestic abuse. So let's not overlook that when we're doing our assessments. But I think the critical thing, and picking up from Karen just now, is that 40% of these deaths actually occur after the ending of the relationships, sometimes immediately after the ending of the relationship. This poses some issues for some mediators who one day, if a mediator practices for 10 years, one day they're going to be encountering a situation like this, or potential risk situation like this at least. Next slide, please, Mike. Thanks. Let's not overlook children that die also. Child deaths between 2005 and 15, 19 children killed by perpetrators, whilst having contact arrangements in place for their children. Over 50% was subject to court orders. The remainder, less formal arrangements. Some involved arrangements made by mediators. And again, this is about protecting the profession, enhancing the training and the sensitizing, but also protecting mediators. As I say, I've personally come across a few careers that have been completely derailed because of, dare I say it, a lack of thorough oversight at the beginning of assessments. Next slide, please. Thanks. Dr. Jane Monckton-Smith, Gloucester University. I'd commend her work at the moment. It's pretty current stuff. She's developed an 8-stage pattern of men who kill their partners. And I'm only just picked out 3 of the stages. These are the most relevant ones for mediators. It's based on 372 killings, so it's a substantive cohort. And what Monckton-Smith's come up with is that stage 4, a trigger that threatens control, all that Karen was talking about earlier, it threatens control, e.g. the ending of a relationship. Once that trigger occurs and a perpetrator feels that the relationship's coming to an end, they will also realize that their opportunity to control and be coercive to that individual, if they truly leave them, will also come to an end. Hence, you'll see escalation will occur. This is where there's intensity and frequency. It's where the abuser is actually losing control. They realize they're losing control and they may well up the ante. It can be subtle. It's not always overt, and I'll come on to some of this a little bit later. But also at stage 6, the abuser can regain control. Now, it may be through reconciling with the person they're abusing, it's not surprising when we see perpetrators go into new relationships and patterns repeat themselves. Or it could be that the perpetrator feels that they can only hang on to some form of control by causing grief. Grief can come in many, many shapes and forms. It could be just general interference. It could be silence. It could be deliberately sabotaging arrangements. And then it can escalate much, much higher. Next slide, please, Mike. Thanks. Distilling from all this, what I feel is incumbent really on the world of mediation is to make sufficient time to assess. I am gobsmacked to this day that there are still many mediation practices or many mediators out there that will knock off an assessment in about 20 minutes. So that's what we hear on the grapevine. Now, it could be that everyone actually is doing a minimum of 1 hour individual assessments, but we know that's not the case. And although it's a recommendation, I understand, and quite rightly, in the MIAMS papers that's come around, I personally believe my minimum assessment is 1 hour and a quarter for each individual. But I think there should be an absolute criteria for a real minimum of 1 hour assessment. And let's have individual assessments. Let's not have joint assessments. I know this may be controversial, and there may well be some exceptions where it's appropriate for both parties to be seen at the same time for an assessment. There are always exceptions. But in the main, how can an individual truly convey what's going on, even if they have, say, an extra period of time added on for their own personal assessment when they go to a joint assessment? The time and the space to be able to speak quite frankly with the mediator. And let's not have back-to-back assessments that go straight into mediation. It doesn't give a chance for the clients to reflect, or those who've got qualms or queries to think things through and maybe consult other people. Check how clients communicate with each other. Quite often I hear of mediators carrying out assessments without having real understanding of what the communication is like between clients, what their negotiation styles may be, what happens when they have arguments, what happens when there's conflict, how do they actually communicate with each other. I like to know this, and I think it's important that mediators do check this out. And it raises for me also the question mark of the suitability of online assessments as opposed to physical assessments. I know that I have a much greater rapport with someone who I'm meeting physically than if I meet them online. At the moment, most of us are working online, but I think it's about getting mediators to sort of consider what the advantages are, or the pros and cons of both online and physical assessment. Certainly when I'm physically assessing, all the senses are at work, you know, even how we smell, even how we taste, even how we feel, and also the non-verbal language, the micro body language. I think can be lost if we're not careful with online communication. I like to ask, particularly when it comes to looking at domestic abuse, I always feel that mediators need to be very, very clear. Some mediators are too oblique. Some tend to sort of do apologetic questioning. And I like to sort of understand what's going on in the world of, as I say, the communication between the two clients. Have there been any recent changes in behaviour from the other party? Tell me about it. Tell me what's anything unusual, anything in recent months that's been slightly different, particularly post-separation. Quite often, a lot of the murders, in many of the murders, there's been no obvious prior domestic abuse. But the abuse will occur once the relationship's ended. Not in all cases, but just in a few of these cases, this will be the case. And so if I was to ask someone, have they been on the receiving end of domestic abuse? Have they had any physical abuse, etc.? They may well say no. if I say, has anything unusual happened since separation? And they say something like, well, not really, apart from it looked like someone had a kick the back door. And a few weeks earlier, my car tyres were let down. The hairs on the back of my neck are starting to rise. It could be that this is a signal of what we call pathological jealousy syndrome. It's where someone can't let go, but they're using a number of behaviours to put the person they're abusing in a very, very uneasy situation. Something just to bear in mind, unusual incidents in recent months. Up-to-date signposting and reporting for information. Well, we've had some fabulous information just given to us in the earlier presentation. And I think it's important we do have this updated information. Now the critical stuff here, mediate or not mediate. Over the years, I've been doing this over 20 odd years, and it's possibly because I was a probation officer for 22 years, and I was also a police hostage negotiation consultant for 7 years. So I've seen what I call the dark side. I've seen what goes bad when it goes truly bad. And sometimes I have to help save mediators from themselves. They often feel that clients have got nowhere else to go. They are picking up issues that there's abuse, there's some quite serious abuse, but they feel nevertheless that they're compelled to mediate this case. And what I'd say is, we know there are pressures coming our way. We know many more cases are going to be coming towards us, and this is great if the world of mediation develops. But so will the area of risk for mediators. And I feel it's absolutely imperative that if there is a hint or a whiff of domestic abuse or anything that makes the clients or the mediator feel uneasy, to discuss this with their PPC, run it through someone else. Take a bit of time out, away from the hothouse atmosphere of the assessment and then making a decision. But calmly and quietly run this past possibly your peers, but certainly consult your PPC and look at a potential risk assessment here. Look in terms of really how should the model of mediation work? How often do we hear of co-work? Very rarely nowadays, unless people are being supported to develop their portfolio. And I certainly feel in the world of mediation, where there are some risks identified, where both clients do feel they can nevertheless mediate, and for some people, bear in mind, to come out of an abusive relationship, they may feel that mediation is part of the process of empowerment for them, so let's not deny them that. But as long as they can actually make decisions independently without being coerced, and they feel they're comfortable in entering mediation to do that, then as mediators, I think it's beholden that we have the right models available for them. So co-work, certainly, really seriously consider it. Let's get it back on the table. Let's look at the notion of an anchor worker, i.e. the main mediator being, or the mediator being the lead mediator, but perhaps having someone in just for that very first session, just to be their eyes and ears. That do they feel that this is an appropriate case to carry on with? We are familiar with shuttle mediation. Certainly we're familiar with online mediation, where people don't have to be in the same room. But we've got the opportunity to do shuttle. And there is a fairly good practice of mediation where people can have their mediation sessions, but still have a mini assessment before each and every mediation session, where the mediator can check out how things are. And bear in mind that as clients do gain trust, particularly individuals that may not have opened up in the assessment, no matter how well conducted the assessment meeting was done originally, they may start trusting in the process and the mediator as it progresses. And in mediation session 2 or 3, they may make a disclosure. So bear in mind, this is dynamic. It was mentioned earlier, it's a dynamic process, risk assessment. And also, if contemplating mediating where there is abuse, do bear in mind how the abuser is going to perceive the mediator. Quite often it's overlooked that the mediator is looking out for the person being abused and trying to balance things, but that has to be balanced also for the abuser to believe that the mediator is still going to be fair and balanced. And that concludes it for me. Thanks, Mike.